Welcome to Thinking Bedtime, a place where philosophy and psychology are told in a slow and gentle manner. Each video offers an insightful perspective, helping to illuminate philosophical and psychological ideas from cultures around the world. Thank you for listening. If you find this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe so that Thinking Bedtime can continue to accompany you. Today, the Thinking Bedtime channel respectfully presents to you and your friends the content with the theme 11 Greek Philosophers Have Shaped the World. Western philosophy, from modern science to ethical and political thought, bears the profound influence of ancient Greek philosophers. Names like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are not only part of the distant past, but continue to subtly shape how people today think about truth, knowledge, and the nature of life. It was the ancient Greek thinkers who initiated an intellectual revolution as humans first actively used reason and logic to explain the world, rather than relying solely on mythology or traditional beliefs. They asked the most fundamental questions. What laws govern the universe? What does it mean to live well? Where does knowledge come from? And what are the boundaries of human understanding? From pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales of Miletus, who sought the first principles of nature, to Socrates with his method of ethical questioning, Plato with his world of ideas, and Aristotle with his comprehensive system of logical and scientific thought, Greek philosophy laid the foundation for Western thinking for thousands of years. Not stopping at the classical period, after Alexander the Great's death, Greek philosophy continued to develop strongly during the Hellenistic period, with three major schools: Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism, focusing deeply on how people live, endure, and seek happiness in a turbulent world. The 11 prominent Greek philosophers mentioned below are the individuals who contributed to shaping the intellectual foundation of the world we live in today. (1) Thales of Miletus, circa 625 to 546 BC. The first Greek philosopher. Thales of Miletus was an ancient Greek philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer who lived in the city-state of Miletus in Ionia, modern-day Western Turkey. He lived around the 7th and 6th centuries BC in Miletus, a wealthy and vibrant city-state on the coast of Ionia, modern-day Turkey. Recognized as one of the 7 sages of Greece, Thales is also considered by Aristotle to be the first in the Western philosophical tradition, not because he knew all the answers, but because he dared to ask the right and different questions more than anyone before him. Today, we know very little about Thales' specific life, and almost no handwritten works of his remain. Most of the information we have comes from later records, such as those by Diogenes Laertius or repetitions by Aristotle. The stories about him, such as measuring the height of the Great Pyramid by its shadow or predicting a solar eclipse, may have been exaggerated over time, but they reflect the image of him in the minds of his contemporaries and later generations, a thinker who was both a philosopher and an explorer of reality. The first notable point about Thales is his approach to the biggest question: what is the nature of the world? Instead of explaining the universe through traditional mythological stories, gods creating the world with supernatural power. Thales seeks the single natural principle from which everything originates. He arrives at a very bold conclusion. Everything comes from water. This perspective may seem simple or even easily mocked in the light of modern science, but at that time it was a revolutionary way of thinking. Thales looked around the world and saw water everywhere. Vast oceans, flowing rivers, rain and snow, water vapor rising into the sky, and all living beings needing water to survive. He observed that water was not only present everywhere, but could also change form, from liquid to solid or gas, and it appeared to be the most essential component of life. Therefore, he attributed to water the role of the fundamental principle of nature, the most basic foundation from which everything is born and to which it will eventually return. This idea carries two profound meanings. On one hand, it is monism, the search for a single fundamental substance behind all transformations of nature. On the other hand, it is the beginning of natural philosophy, providing explanations for the world based on natural laws rather than mythology. For the ancient Greeks, who were accustomed to storytelling with gods and legends, Thales' proposal of the principle of natural science was a leap forward in rational thinking. A remaining part of Thales' thought is his conception of the earth and the universe. He believed that the earth floats on water, similar to a piece of wood on a lake. Natural balance keeps the earth in a stable position. He explained phenomena like earthquakes as disturbances of water beneath the ground rather than as the wrath of gods. In an era when most natural phenomena were explained by supernatural powers, such thinking opened a new way to understand the world. Besides water as the principle of matter, Thales also had initial ideas about the soul and life. According to Aristotle, he believed that everything has something like a soul because it enables them to move or interact. For example, a magnet attracting iron. Aristotle recorded that Thales once said that everything is full of soul in some form. This idea is not exactly the same as how we understand the soul today, but it reflects an early attempt to attribute the nature of movement and life, rather than attributing everything to divine actions. Thales is also recognized as the first person in the Western tradition to seriously question the cause of natural phenomena and to seek answers through observation and reasoning. This marks the transition from mythological thinking to primitive scientific thought. He laid the foundation for later thinkers such as Anaximander and Anaximenes, who continued the search for the fundamental principle of the universe, even if they chose different materials instead of water. All three are classified within the Milesian school and are regarded as the pioneers of natural philosophy. Not only limited to abstract philosophy, Thales also had notable practical applications. Legends about him say that he used his knowledge of astronomy and mathematics to predict the solar eclipse of 585 BC, an event recorded by Herodotus, although modern experts believe that such detailed predictive formulas would have been difficult to achieve with the knowledge available at that time. Therefore, this story should be seen as illustrating his influence in astronomical thinking rather than as definitive empirical evidence. Another famous story tells that Thales used his knowledge to exploit the olive market by renting all the olive presses before the harvest season and reselling them at a higher price when demand increased. This shows that he was not only a thinker, but also someone with practical strategic thinking. Aristotle recounts that he did this to prove to those who mocked philosophers for being poor that philosophers could indeed be wealthy if they wished.
An end-of-life legend says that Thales died from heatstroke while watching an Olympic festival, and another story suggests that he died after falling into a well because he was too busy looking at the sky, as an allegory for how he was so focused on rational thinking that he forgot the simple things of everyday life. Whether true or not, these two stories symbolize the two sides of his life. One, enthusiastic about rational nature, and the other judged by life itself through the abstract nature of thought. Thales's legacy is extremely important. He not only laid the foundation for philosophy, but also for science and mathematics in the Western world later on. The idea of seeking natural principles instead of myths was the salvation of the logical and scientific revolution. It empowered humans to question, analyze, and understand the world more objectively. Looking back over more than 2,600 years, it is clear that Thales was not the prophet of all modern truths. He was mistaken in choosing water as the origin of all things, but the most significant contribution he left behind was his way of asking questions and laying the foundation for new natural thinking. Thanks to him, questions about the nature of the world began to be answered through reason rather than mythology.
Two, Anaximander, circa 610 to 546 BC, philosophy of the infinite. Anaximander of Miletus is one of the most remarkable minds of the ancient world, not because he provided correct answers by today's scientific standards, but because he was the first to think in a completely different way. If Thales was the one who opened the door to rational thought by seeking a natural principle for all things, then Anaximander was the one who stepped further into that room and saw that the nature of the world could go far beyond all the specific elements familiar to humans. Anaximander was born around the early 6th century BC in Miletus, the same city-state as Thales. He is often regarded as a student or direct successor of Thales, but his thinking did not stop at merely correcting or supplementing his teacher. Instead, Anaximander made a bold intellectual leap. He rejected the idea that a specific substance like water could be the ultimate source of everything. According to him, if water is the principle of all things, then what explains the existence of fire, the direct opposite of water? And if each element has its opposite, then no element can serve as the absolute foundational principle.
From that suspicion, Anaximander introduced a concept never before seen in the history of Western thought, a peiron. A peiron means the infinite, indeterminate, and without clear boundaries. It is not water, fire, air, or earth, but a deeper, more abstract reality from which all things originate and then return. According to Anaximander, a peiron is eternal, neither born nor destroyed, constantly moving and creating the world through opposing pairs such as hot, cold, dry, wet. In a rare remaining passage believed to be written by Anaximander himself, he states that all things return to each other in accordance with the order of time. This is an extremely powerful expression. The world, in Anaximander's view, is not a stage where capricious gods intervene, but a natural system with order, where everything is born, develops, and perishes according to inevitable laws. Beyond abstract philosophy, Anaximander was also a pioneering scientific thinker. He is considered the first to write a complete natural philosophy work called On Nature. Although this work has been almost entirely lost, what is recorded shows that he attempted to explain astronomy, geography, meteorology, and the origin of life within a unified theoretical framework.
Anaximander was the first in Western history to propose the idea that the Earth does not need anything to support it. Instead of resting on water, as Thales believed, the Earth, according to Anaximander, exists freely in space, maintaining a stable position because it is balanced in all directions. Although his conception of the Earth was as a cylindrical mass rather than a sphere, the core idea is extremely bold. The Earth does not require gods or any supporting objects, but exists through natural order. He also has his own observations about the sun, the moon, and the stars. According to Anaximander, celestial bodies are giant rings of fire surrounding the Earth, and the light that humans see is only the part of the fire shining through holes in these rings. Although this model is not consistent with modern science, it clearly represents an effort to explain the universe through physical structures rather than mythology. One of Anaximander's most astonishing ideas concerns the concept of life. He believed that the first creatures appeared in moist environments, and humans were not created initially in their current form. According to him, humans may have originally lived within fish-like creatures and only gradually developed into their complete form. This is an extremely rare way of thinking in the ancient world and is often regarded as an early form of evolutionary thought.
Anaximander was also the first person recorded to have drawn a world map. This map depicted the known lands around the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and neighboring regions, helping the Greeks visualize the geographical space systematically. He is also believed to have brought the sundial, the gnomon, from the east to Greece, contributing to time measurement and the determination of seasons. What makes Anaximander special does not lie in the specific details of his theories, but in his spirit of thinking. He was the first in Western history to dare to say that the origin of the world does not necessarily have to be something humans can see or touch. He took philosophy beyond the realm of concrete matter and entered the domain of abstract thought, where concepts such as infinity, necessity, and natural order began to take shape.
The legacy of Anaximander directly influenced subsequent philosophers, especially Anaximenes, and further extended to the entire tradition of ancient Greek philosophy. If Thales laid the first stone, then Anaximander was the one who expanded that foundation, allowing philosophy and science to develop as independent fields from mythology. Anaximander does not provide us with ultimate truths, but he gave humanity something more important, a way to view the world as an understandable whole through reason. And from that moment, humans began a long journey to explore the universe, not through prayer, but through thought.
Heraclitus, circa 535 to 475 BC, the philosopher of change. Heraclitus of Ephesus is one of the most famous pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece, but he is also one of the most elusive. His name is associated with a profound and sometimes obscure idea about the nature of reality. It is constant movement, and this principle is linked to the famous phrase "panta rei," everything flows or everything changes. However, Heraclitus himself may never have actually uttered this phrase, but his philosophy is perfectly summarized by it, because in his philosophy nothing remains still. Everything is in constant flux and transformation. Heraclitus was born around the early 5th century BC in the city of Ephesus, located on the coast of Ionia, a place rich in cultural and intellectual exchange. He is often called the philosopher of change or the obscure sage because he expressed his ideas through concise yet paradoxical statements that compel deep reflection on the nature of reality. The key point in Heraclitus's philosophy is that nothing is purely static. Everything is in a state of becoming rather than being. For him, the universe is not a collection of fixed objects, but a continuous flow of transformation and change. He illustrated this with the image of a river. He said, "You cannot step into the same river twice, because the water in the river is always flowing away and being replaced, and even the person stepping in has changed over the passing of time."
That idea is not simply about superficial change. For Heraclitus, the very essence of reality is constant transformation. Everything, from living beings to rocks, from thoughts to humans, is in a state of perpetual flux. Existence is not a fixed point, but a process, a continuous flow, in which everything is born, transformed, and dissolved to make way for new states. Therefore, the principle of panta rei, although not his original words, but the most accurate summary of his thought, emphasizes that everything changes, and nothing remains the same forever. This idea was a revolution against the traditional thinking of that time, because before Heraclitus, many philosophers tried to find an unchanging principle, a fixed element as the foundation of all things. But he, on the contrary, believed that motion and change are the fundamental nature of existence. Heraclitus used a very unique form to describe the structure of the world: fire. In some remaining passages, he describes the universe as an eternal flame, constantly burning and alternating between growth and decay in endless cycles. Fire is a symbolic image of transformation, born, destroyed, and reborn, an ever-active force that constantly changes everything.
Another important concept in Heraclitus's thought is the unity of opposites. While most of us see pairs like life and death, hot and cold, or good and evil as completely separate, Heraclitus believed they do not exist independently, but are always harmonized and interdependent within a dynamic process. He even said that the way up and the way down are one and the same, because in the continuous flow of change, a state is always intertwined with its opposite, and vice versa. This leads to a profound understanding. Opposition does not eliminate each other, but exists as two sides of the same dynamic process. Heraclitus also emphasized that conflict, contradiction, and opposition are not negative or chaotic, but are the driving forces behind life, creativity, and the order of the world. In one of his remaining philosophical fragments, he describes war as the father of all, because the tension between opposing forces creates the continuous birth and transformation of all things.
Additionally, Heraclitus used the term logos, a concept difficult to translate into Vietnamese. Logos, for him, means a rational principle, a deep order governing all change in the universe. Logos is the universal law that makes the flow of transformation not pure chaos, but a structured cycle with a logical pattern, an order that can be understood if we know how to look deeply into the nature of things. He complained that most people do not understand logos, so they perceive things in a fragmented and distorted way, like people who are sleeping soundly in a long dream. This causes Heraclitus to be both known as a pioneer and regarded as a solitary and difficult to approach philosopher, because he not only talks about external change, but also points out that ourselves, thoughts, perceptions, emotions, are never still. When we enter the world, we do not only see external transformations, but we are also part of that flow of change, inseparable.
Heraclitus's ideas marked a significant turning point in the history of philosophy. Instead of viewing the universe as a collection of fixed entities, he proposed it as a continuous, dynamic, and unceasing process. This idea starkly contrasts with philosophers like Parmenides, who believed that reality is fundamentally unchanging and immutable. The opposition between Heraclitus and Parmenides has created one of the longest-standing debates in the history of philosophy about the nature of existence, flux, or permanence. In summary, although Panta Rhei, everything flows, may not be an exact quote from Heraclitus, it still embodies the core spirit of his entire philosophy. The world is not a static picture, but a continuous, dynamic painting of transformation, harmony of opposites, and governed by logos. In every moment of life, each passing second is part of that flow of change. No one and nothing can remain still.
(4) Pythagoras, circa 570 to 490 BC, the father of mathematics. Pythagoras of Samos is one of the most famous figures in the history of ancient thought, but at the same time, he is also one of the most misunderstood. He lived approximately from 570 to 490 BC, born on the island of Samos off the eastern coast of the ancient Greek world, and later migrated to the city of Croton in southern Italy, where he established his community and ideas. The first thing to note about Pythagoras is he did not write anything. No works of his have survived to this day, and what we know about him comes from later records, mostly written hundreds of years after his death. Therefore, determining exactly what Pythagoras truly thought and taught
is one of the greatest challenges in the study of ancient philosophy. Due to the lack of contemporary sources, images of Pythagoras later became a mixture of legend and history. By the Roman and early Greek centuries AD, he was revered as an almost semi-divine figure sent from the gods to enlighten humanity. Many works were even forged to attribute to him in an attempt to prove that all correct knowledge later originated from Pythagoras. These fabricated stories include supernatural tales, such as him having a golden thigh or being able to appear in two places at once.
Thus, attitudes towards Pythagoras range from worshiping him as a semi-divine figure in the Neo-Pythagorean tradition to a more cautious historical perspective in modern research. A great thinker who created a community and a mode of thought that placed humans within a system of numerical order, where numbers are not just mathematical tools, but the key to understanding the universe, the soul, and ethics.
However, more important than anything else about Pythagoras is his role as the founder of a way of life and a unique philosophical religious organization. His followers, called Pythagoreans, not only studied logic and arithmetic, but also adhered to ethical rules and practiced introspection. They believed that by living in accordance with numerical principles and harmony, the soul could achieve purification and progress to a better realm after death. Therefore, Pythagoras is regarded as a pioneer of natural and metaphysical philosophy later on, not merely through specific scientific works, but through his integration of numerical thinking, ethics, and religion into a unified system. These ideas had a significant impact on Plato, and through him deeply influenced the Western philosophical tradition that followed. An interesting point is that Plato and Aristotle were very cautious when it came to Pythagoras. Both philosophers only mentioned him as the founder of a way of life, not as part of the natural philosophical tradition like other pre-Socratics. Plato only once referred to Pythagoras as the originator of a way of life, and did not attribute to him any major metaphysical systems as later legends claimed. This indicates that even in ancient times, people were aware of the distinction between the myths about Pythagoras and the historical reality.
In later tradition, Pythagoras is best known for the so-called Pythagorean theorem in mathematics, that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. But in fact, the earliest evidence does not show that he proved this theorem, and he himself was probably not the one who invented it. This fundamental truth had already been used by the ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian mathematical traditions long before Pythagoras appeared. However, in his later legacy, Pythagoras and his community are regarded as having valued the numerical relationship as a fundamental principle of the universe, viewing numbers as the essence of all phenomena. In the earliest depictions of Pythagoras' ideas, he described the universe as a system organized according to numerical relationships and moral principles. This differs from the purely physical thinking of pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales or Anaximander, who attempted to explain nature through material principles. For Pythagoras, numbers and mathematical ratios not only describe reality, but also represent the moral order and structure of the universe.
One of the most famous images from later tradition is the idea of the harmony of the spheres, that planets and celestial bodies move according to numerical ratios, similar to the ratios of musical intervals, creating a music of the heavens. In this tradition, the universe is not merely a cold mechanical machine, but a harmonious organization that unites material and spiritual elements through mathematics and music. If we set aside those later legends and look at the earliest evidence, we encounter a more realistic picture, a person known to the public of that time for fields very different from mathematics, such as understanding the fate of souls after death, guiding religious rituals, and founding a stoic and strict way of life. In the ancient Greek world, Pythagoras was best known for his belief that the soul is immortal and will be reborn in many lives, a concept called metempsychosis, the rebirth of the soul after death. This idea made him one of the first in Western thought to suggest that the soul is not destroyed with the body, but continues the continuous cycle of life. Pythagoras is also known as the founder of a religious philosophical movement, rather than just an abstract thinker. He established a highly disciplined community of priests who followed strict rules regarding lifestyle, including dietary restrictions, regular religious rituals, and a way of life characterized by self-control and self-cultivation. This was not only a philosophical school, but also a comprehensive way of life that disciples were required to practice daily.
Five. Protagoras, circa 420 to 420 BC, the relative philosopher. Protagoras is one of the most prominent figures of the 5th century BC in Greece, not because he was an idealist philosopher or a systematic thinker, but because he challenged the way people think about knowledge, language, and truth. He is a symbol of the sophist movement, teachers of rhetoric, reasoning, and debate arts who were paid, emerging strongly during Athens's development of democracy, where citizens needed persuasive skills to participate in politics and court proceedings. Protagoras was born in Abdera, a coastal city-state, and moved to Athens, the largest political and cultural center of Greece, where he became a highly influential and controversial figure. He did not leave any original works that have survived to this day. Most of what remains about his ideas comes from Plato's dialogues and descriptions by later thinkers. Among these, the most famous quote attributed to Protagoras is, "Man is the measure of all things," an extremely profound and also highly controversial statement, laying the foundation for a philosophical view later known as relativism.
This simple yet powerful idea states that what is right or wrong, exists or does not exist, depends on individual perception and perspective. If one person feels something is right, then it is right for that person. If another feels the opposite, then it is right for the other. There is no single objective standard to determine truth. This is the core of Protagoras' philosophy and the seed of a fundamentally human-centered worldview. Humans are at the center of all judgments. Protagoras' view appeals to many because in an era when ordinary citizens need reasoning and eloquence to defend their rights in court or speak on democratic platforms, understanding that truth is in the eye of the beholder grants a certain power. However, This very idea also made him a target of fierce criticism from other thinkers, most notably Plato. Plato, as the character Socrates in his dialogues, dedicates many pages to refuting Protagoras' relativistic views. He argues that if everything is truly relative, meaning that truth always depends on individual perspective, then Protagoras' own statement must also be considered relative. Therefore, if everything is relative, is only true for one person, it cannot be a universal truth for all. This presents an internal contradiction, and Plato uses this as a counter-argument to demonstrate that Protagoras' relativistic philosophy self-contradicts. But Plato's critique does not stop at this logical contradiction. He also raises a greater question about the meaning and practical consequences of relativism for society and humanity. If all knowledge and judgment are merely products of personal experience, then how can people exchange ideas, debate, and reach consensus on shared values? How can true democracy exist without an objective foundation of knowledge and ethics that everyone shares? Plato believed that accepting relativism would weaken the ability to cooperate, discuss, and even erode people's moral responsibility. With Protagoras, teaching rhetoric and debate is nothing wrong. He sees it as an essential skill in a democratic society. But Plato saw something different. When the skill of rhetoric is separated from the pursuit of truth, it becomes a convenient, persuasive tool, capable of being used to win arguments without regard for right or wrong. This is what made Plato concerned, because he believed that the art of speaking well cannot replace the art of thinking correctly.
Another aspect of the debate between Protagoras and Plato concerns the nature of knowledge and perception. Protagoras seems not to clearly distinguish between knowledge and sensory perception. Within his framework, each person's subjective experience is the ultimate standard. Plato refutes this by arguing that true knowledge must go beyond personal perception to reach immutable and objective principles, something he later describes in the theory of forms, perfect ideas that exist independently of the sensory world. For Plato, the ignorant only know the impressions given by the senses, while true knowledge comes only through reason and deep inquiry. Interestingly, Protagoras' relativistic view was not only opposed by Plato, but also caused many people of his time to worry about its moral consequences. If it is true that each person determines their own truth, then responsibility for actions and moral standards also become ambiguous. Who can judge whether an action is right or wrong? How can laws be established when everyone can justify their own reasons for their actions? Such questions led Plato and many other thinkers to see relativism as a threat to society. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that Protagoras made a significant advance in ancient Greek thought. He forced people to think about truth, perception, and the role of language on a personal level, paving the way for profound debates on epistemology later on. Even when Plato rejected his views, Protagoras' challenge created a robust platform for critical discussion, enriching the development of Greek philosophy. Protagoras is also considered a pioneer in turning knowledge into a profession that can be taught and learned, with tuition fees, classes, and students, something that few people thought of before.
Although later the sophists were discredited in Western philosophical tradition, this does not entirely mean they were wrong. Rather, it is largely because Plato and subsequent thinkers set higher standards for philosophy. Philosophy is not just the art of persuasion, but a journey to seek truth, justice, and deep understanding. In the dialogue between Protagoras' ideas and Plato's rebuttal, we see one of the earliest conflicts of thought between relativism and objectivism, a topic still widely debated today. Protagoras places humans at the center of all judgments, emphasizing personal experience and sensory perception. In contrast, Plato seeks a universal, unchanging standard for truth and knowledge.
From the perspective of today's era, it can be seen that each side has its own value. Protagoras reminds us of the diversity in personal experience, while Plato emphasizes the importance of maintaining an objective foundation for society to share and discuss. The dialogue between these two ideas offers us not only a historical lesson, but also a vital question. Who does the truth belong to, and how do we approach it?
6. Socrates, 469 to 399 BC. The founder of Western thought. Socrates is a living paradox of Western philosophy. He laid the foundation for the tradition of moral philosophy and deep self-reflection, yet left no writings of his own. All that posterity knows about him comes through others' accounts, mainly Plato and Xenophon, along with satirical images in Aristophanes' plays. However, this very absence makes Socrates a unique figure. He does not exist as a closed doctrine, but rather as a way of living and thinking. Socrates was born in Athens around 469 BC, during a period when the city-state was flourishing with democracy, art, and public debate. Unlike pre-Socratic thinkers who focused on the structure of the universe, the nature of matter, or natural origins, Socrates turned entirely towards human beings. What he wanted to understand was not how the world operates, but how people should live within that world. From this point, philosophy began to take a new direction, from cosmology to ethics and human philosophy.
Socrates did not open a school, charge tuition, or write books. He appeared in the most ordinary places, squares, markets, workshops, and training grounds. He talked with all social classes, from politicians, poets, and generals to blacksmiths and young people. But instead of teaching by imparting knowledge, he asked questions. These questions seemed simple, even naive, but the more they answered, the more the interlocutors found themselves in awkward situations, as they gradually realized that what they took for granted was actually lacking a solid foundation. It was from this that the famous Socratic method was born. Socrates did not assert, he inquired. He did not impose truths, he forced others to see the contradictions within their own thoughts. This process often led to an uncomfortable state, a sense of disorientation, confusion, and even shame. But for Socrates, this was not a failure, but the beginning of knowledge. Only when people realize they do not know can they truly start to learn. The saying, "I know that I know nothing," is therefore not a form of self-deprecation, but rather a philosophical stance.
Socrates believed that most people live in the illusion of understanding. They think they know what justice is, what courage is, what morality is, but when questioned to the very end, these definitions quickly collapse. Socrates saw breaking that illusion as an urgent task, because a life that is not examined, not questioned, is a life led more by habit and public opinion than by reason. Deeper down, Socrates' philosophy revolves around a core belief. Evil does not stem from malicious intent, but from ignorance. People do wrong because they do not truly understand what is good. Therefore, knowledge and morality are inseparable. Knowing what is good leads to acting rightly. Understanding correctly leads to living rightly. This is a very strong and controversial view because it denies the idea that people intentionally choose evil. For Socrates, the root of all mistakes is ignorance, not depravity. From this belief, Socrates places absolute priority on caring for the soul. He believes that wealth, fame, or power are secondary if a person does not live morally upright. A society can be wealthy, but hollow if its citizens do not practice self-reflection. That is why Socrates often makes those in power uncomfortable, because he exposes the gap between the image they build and their true understanding.
That discomfort gradually accumulated into hostility. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens fell into political and spiritual crisis. Some of Socrates' students were involved in anti-democratic upheavals, making his image even more suspicious in the eyes of the public. Although Socrates did not directly participate in politics, his questioning of authority, tradition, and popular beliefs was seen as dangerous to social order. In 399 BC, Socrates was put on trial on two main charges: disrespecting the city's gods and corrupting the youth. This trial was not just a personal case, but a confrontation between freedom of thought and the fear of a society that had just experienced upheaval. Socrates had the chance to escape death, but he refused. He believed that fleeing would betray the very principles he had spent his life defending. The death of Socrates by hemlock poison is not merely a tragedy, it is the culmination of his life's logic. He accepted death not out of despair, but because he believed living against reason and justice was worse than dying. This attitude made Socrates an eternal symbol of morality, a person who would rather lose his life than betray the truth he believed to be right.
Socrates' legacy does not lie in a complete philosophical system, but in a spirit. Plato continued to develop this spirit into dialogues and doctrines. Aristotle systematized it into the science of philosophy, and later schools each carried a part of the Socratic spirit in their own way. But at its core, Socrates remains a reminder that philosophy is not about possessing answers, but about constantly asking the right questions. If I had to say why Socrates still lives in the human mind, it is because he forces people to confront themselves. He does not offer us easy reassurance, but provides us with the necessary unease to grow. In a world where people are always in a hurry to assert their correctness, Socrates whispers the opposite. Slow down. Doubt. Question yourself, because only from there can a truly meaningful life begin.
Plato, 427 to 347 BC.
The most famous Greek philosopher. Plato is one of the greatest philosophers in human history who shaped the entire framework of Western philosophical thought. He not only laid the foundation for a complete philosophical system with theories on reality, knowledge, ethics, and politics, but also was a central figure in over 30 philosophical works presented in the form of dialogues, a presentation style that makes philosophy both profound and humane. Plato was born around 428 or 427 BC in Athens, into a noble family with political and intellectual lineage. His birth name was Aristocles, but later everyone called him Plato, perhaps because of his broad stature, broad in ancient Greek. From a young age, Plato received a comprehensive education in fields of music, poetry, grammar, physical education, and mathematics, knowledge considered the foundation of a well-rounded individual according to classical education standards. The life of Plato took a decisive turn when he met Socrates, the teacher who would profoundly influence all his later ideas. Plato was not yet 20 years old at the time, and Socrates, with his dialectical method, not only challenged conventional assumptions, but also instilled in him the belief that knowledge does not come from imitation or memorization, but from self-examination and questioning the very things we believe to be true. Socrates was sentenced to death in 399 BC, an event that shocked Plato and disillusioned him with Athenian democracy. Plato witnessed the democratic government execute his teacher for being accused of corrupting the youth and blaspheming the city's gods. These successive experiences led Plato to deeply reflect on the nature of justice, knowledge, and political power, becoming the driving force behind his development of a philosophical system where philosophy is not just dry debate, but the foundation for guiding life and society. After traveling through Egypt, Italy, and Sicily to learn various traditions of knowledge, Plato returned to Athens and founded the Academy around 388 BC, one of the oldest educational institutions in Western history. Here he taught, debated, and wrote dialogues that later became the foundation of philosophy as we know it today. What sets Plato apart from earlier philosophers is his combination of reason and imagery, logic and storytelling. His works, such as the Republic, Symposium, Phaedo, and Apology, are all written in dialogue form, often featuring Socrates as the main character. This reflects Plato's deep belief that truth is not something to be proclaimed once and for all, but something to be discovered through dialogue, discussion, and continuous debate. The core idea of Plato is the belief that the world we perceive through our senses, the material world, is only a faint copy of a higher, more perfect, and more complete reality, which he calls forms or ideas. According to Plato, forms are unchanging and perfect entities behind each concept, such as justice, beauty, and goodness. They do not change over time or space and are independent of human subjective perception. Only through innate reason and introspective thinking can humans access this world. Plato envisioned the material world as shadows on the wall of a cave. These shadows being faint images of real entities existing outside the cave. This theory is called the allegory of the cave, and it remains one of the most profound metaphors for self-awareness and truth. The person imprisoned in the cave only knows the world through the shadows and believes that is the only reality. But if that person escapes the cave, sees the sunlight and the true nature of all things, he understands that the hand holding the truth is not in the shadow, but in the light illuminating that truth, the light of reason and deep understanding. One of the greatest consequences of the theory of forms is Plato's epistemology. He believed that human intellect does not start from zero. Instead, our consciousness has innate knowledge from before the soul enters the body. According to Plato, learning in life is not about acquiring new knowledge, but about recollecting. Recollection, anamnesis, what the soul has known in the realm of forms. Therefore, humans do not gather knowledge from sensation. Instead, sensations often cause confusion and lead to false judgments. Only through dialectical thinking, through logical dialogue, can we remember our original truth. Plato's ideas do not only stop at abstract theory. He also extends to politics and ethics in The Republic, his most classic work. Plato criticizes Athenian democracy because, in his view, democracy easily turns into a system where the most deceitful and eloquent individuals often prevail over those with true knowledge. He proposes an ideal social model governed by philosopher kings, individuals who not only understand reason and knowledge, but also possess moral qualities to lead society with justice and truth. In this model, society is divided into three classes: the rulers, philosopher kings, the guardians, who maintained order, and the producers. Each class has its own role based on their innate abilities and tendencies. The philosopher leader rules not for power, but for wisdom and morality, because only when understanding the form of the good, the highest of all forms, can the leader enact just and beneficial laws for the community. Along with politics, Plato also delves deeper into questions about personal ethics. What makes a person good? How does one achieve a balance between reason, spirit, and desire? He believes that only when reason governs the spirit and desires within the soul can a person truly stand firm on the path of virtuous living. Therefore, knowledge is not only understanding the world, but also the power to regulate oneself towards goodness. Plato's dialogues on love, such as the Symposium, expand the depth of his thought. Love is not merely physical desire, but a pursuit of beauty and absolute truth. Through each character's speech in the dialogue, Plato shows that love can be a pathway to a deeper understanding of oneself and the world. Another interesting aspect of Plato's thought is his conception of the soul and death presented in Phaedo. Here, through Socrates' narration, he argues for the immortality of the soul. The soul does not merely temporarily exist within the body, but is an entity that transcends memory and the physical body, and over the course of time it can continue to engage with the absolute forms. This is not only metaphysical, but also forms the basis for the moral idea that the soul must be liberated from material constraints to attain true wisdom. Throughout his life, Plato also used language and metaphors to express his ideas. The allegory of the cave, images of light and darkness, and models of social structures all serve as tools to help readers look beyond appearances and access deeper layers of truth. This is a characteristic of the Platonic style, idealizing, abstracting, and not retreating from questions that seem impossible to answer. Plato died around 348–347 BC in Athens, but his influence was never diminished. His most prominent student, Aristotle, although critiquing many of Plato's ideas, continued the tradition of deep critical thinking that Plato initiated. The philosophy of Platonism later spread through various schools of thought, from Neoplatonism to the Renaissance and even modern philosophy. Plato's life and ideas make us question not only the external world, but also the very nature of knowledge, truth, justice, and beauty. He not only taught us how to think, he challenged us to reconsider the values we believe to be certain. And it is this that makes Plato not just an ancient philosopher, but an enduring symbol of human thought.
8. Aristotle, circa 384 to 322 BC, the father of logic. Aristotle is one of the greatest thinkers in human history, laying the foundations for logic, science, philosophy, politics, and many other important fields of thought. He was born around 384 BC in Stagira, a small city in northern Greece, into a family with a tradition of medicine and knowledge. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to the Macedonian king, which perhaps instilled in Aristotle a deep interest in nature and living bodies, an interest that later became a central part of his entire intellectual career. When he was young, Aristotle came to Athens and joined Plato's academy, where he was trained under Plato's direct guidance for more than 2 decades. The relationship between the two was not only that of student and teacher, but also a profound exchange and critique of ideas. Plato made Aristotle think at an abstract and ideal level, but it was Aristotle who grounded philosophy in practical logic, transforming it from an idealistic study into a system of thought based on observation, reasoning, and analysis.
Aristotle's influence was widespread. From the 1st century AD, Muslim scholars such as Avicenna and Averroes propagated Aristotelian ideas into the Islamic world, then transmitted them to medieval Europe, becoming the backbone of Thomism and scholasticism. Subsequently, from the scientific revolution to modern philosophy, many of Aristotle's logical principles and methodological approaches continued to serve as foundational. Aristotle died in 322 BC, but his ideas have never faded. He was not only the most prominent ancient philosopher after Plato, he is also the founder of Western thought, a figure with whom any scholar of philosophy, science, or ethics must engage in dialogue. In addition to these foundational contributions, Aristotle was also a pioneer in fields that seem separate, such as poetry and art with Poetics, where he analyzed the structure of tragedy and the role of emotion in art, as well as psychology and epistemology through De Anima, on the soul, in which he viewed the soul, psyche, not as a separate entity from the body, but as the form of life, what makes a living being itself. It can be said that Aristotle was the person who pioneered a methodology that later became the foundation of science and systematic thinking. He combined empirical observation, logical deduction, and conceptual analysis
into a single system. His use of logic to construct arguments caused philosophy and science to no longer be two separate domains, but to become an integrated whole, capable of explaining both the natural and social worlds.
The concept of virtue by Aristotle is distinctly different from that of earlier philosophers. He divided virtues into two types: intellectual virtues related to thinking and reasoning, and moral virtues related to habits and behavior. Notably, Aristotle did not believe that humans are born with virtues. Instead, virtues are developed through practice and rational reflection, a revolutionary idea for practical ethics. The deeper insight here lies in how Aristotle places reason and humans at the center of philosophy. He opposed the idea that truth or morality is entirely metaphysical and detached from reality. Instead, he believed that humans are rational beings, and reason is the tool to understand the nature of things and live a better life. This represents one of the greatest leaps in human thought. Philosophy is no longer just abstract observation, but becomes the art of living and acting rightly in the real world. Aristotle also wrote about politics with keen insight. In politics, he viewed the state, polis, as a complex whole of social and moral relationships. He believed that the goal of politics was not only to maintain order, but also to create conditions for citizens to live well and happily. The ideal state, according to Aristotle, is one in which each citizen can fully develop their human capacities, from thinking to acting rightly and serving the community.
Unlike Plato, who believed in abstract ideal world, Aristotle held that reality is something that can be observed and analyzed through experience. He focused on what exists, on the nature of living beings, matter, and the dynamics of nature. He believed that understanding the essence of things requires considering both aspects, what we observe and the logical laws that govern them. This positioned Aristotle as both a philosopher and the first scientist, with a methodology that profoundly influenced fields such as biology, physics, psychology, and epistemology. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle poses a fundamental question for human life. What makes a good life? He believes that the highest goal of human action is to achieve eudaimonia, a concept often translated as happiness or prosperity, but not in the sense of fleeting pleasure, rather as a state of fulfilling rational capacity and complete moral virtue. This means that happiness is not about pleasure or wealth, but about living a virtuous life where reason governs actions and decisions. After Plato's death, Aristotle left Athens and accepted the tutorship of Alexander the Great, a historic decision. During the time Aristotle was Alexander's teacher, he not only taught philosophy, but also imparted to the young prince extensive knowledge of culture, poetry, science, mathematics, and politics. These lessons influenced how Alexander thought about power, strategy, and the role of a leader in the Greek world and beyond. Aristotle returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum, a school of philosophy that introduced a new approach to knowledge. Students not only listened to lectures, but also analyzed, collected data, observed nature, and developed methodologies to understand the essence of things.
This made Aristotle the most impressive philosopher in the history of Western thought, not only in theory, but also in empirical evidence and methodology. One of Aristotle's most notable contributions is the first complete logical system in history. He not only established basic rules for rational reasoning, but also systematized them into logical structures we now call syllogisms. This forms the foundation for understanding how hypotheses lead to valid conclusions, an essential skill in scientific, legal, and philosophical thinking.
9. Epicurus, 341 BC to 270 BC, the seeker of tranquility. Epicurus is one of the most influential, yet often misunderstood ancient Greek philosophers in the history of Western thought. He was born around 341 BC in Gargatus near Athens, but was raised amidst various contexts in Ionia before becoming a prominent figure of the Hellenistic period. His entire life was dedicated to developing a comprehensive philosophical system where knowledge, nature, and ethics intertwine to answer a simple yet extremely difficult question: how can humans live happily and peacefully? The philosophy of Epicureanism is not a series of disconnected propositions. It is a unified worldview consisting of 4 main parts: the purpose of life, the theory of knowledge, natural description based on atomic materialism, and the analysis of the social origins of humanity. Epicurus believed that only when his system of thought fits together could people avoid fear, sorrow, or misguided desires.
Life and the shift in thinking. Epicurus grew up in a context of diverse philosophical movements that were often fiercely debated. He traveled from Athens to places like Lesbos and Lampsacus, teaching and attracting students before finally returning to Athens around 307 BC, where he purchased a small garden, simply called the Garden. This was not just a school. It was a community living by philosophy, where students and Epicurus practiced their ideas together in a tangible way, rather than merely engaging in dry debate. Materialism. The world is made of atoms and void. Epicurus inherited the atomistic tradition from Democritus, but made it the foundation of his entire system. He believed that the universe is composed of invisible atoms moving through empty space, void. Everything we perceive as colors, tastes, or sounds is the result of how atoms are structured and interact with each other. There is no room for an immortal soul or supernatural entities controlling the universe. Only matter and void. The deepest point here is not just an image of the material universe, but how Epicurus used it to free people from supernatural fears. Because if the soul does not exist after death, then the so-called eternal punishment cannot occur, and the fear of death is a harmful illusion rather than a real danger.
Epistemology. The senses are the standard of knowledge. Epicurus was a thorough empiricist. He believed that all knowledge originates from the senses,
The observer's perception of pain and pleasure is the accurate measure. There are no transcendental sources of knowledge, divine symbols, or supreme rules. What we see, hear, and feel, that is the primary evidence of reality. This is not only an early scientific declaration, but also a liberating one. It grants humans the right to determine truth based on personal experience rather than authority or rumor. However, Epicurus also understood that mistaken habits and deep-seated fears are not easily eliminated. Therefore, he proposed mental exercises for his students, more of a therapy than just philosophy, to help them perceive things correctly and eliminate worries about unreal things. Moral goal. Happiness is the absence of anxiety and pain. The most prominent and often misunderstood point of Epicurus is the identification of happiness, hedone, as the ultimate goal of life, but with a very different definition from what people usually imagine. Happiness is not shallow pleasure or the gratification of insatiable desires, but a state of inner peace, ataraxia, along with the absence of physical pain, aponia. Epicurus emphasized that the human system of desires is the root cause of suffering and anxiety. Unnatural and unnecessary desires, such as unlimited ambition, power, or excessive pleasure, only cause distress when they are not fulfilled. Therefore, the goal is not to maximize pleasure, but to minimize pain and fear, both physical and mental. For this reason, Epicurus urged his followers to focus on natural and necessary needs, eating, sleeping, friendship, and self-control, and to eliminate unnecessary desires. When these worries disappear, the mind becomes truly tranquil, and happiness can emerge. Attitude towards death and the divine. One of Epicurus's most profound points is his approach to death and religious faith. He believed that death is not to be feared because when we die, we no longer exist to feel pain. According to Epicurus, the fear of death is a form of irrational anxiety caused by humans confusing the experience of living with the non-experience of death. Regarding the divine, he does not deny the existence of gods, but rejects their role in human life. According to him, the divine are immortal and happy beings who do not care about or interfere in the human world. Therefore, fearing punishment from the gods is an unnecessary worry to be abandoned in order to achieve ataraxia. Friends, society, and political attitude. Contrary to the common misconception that Epicureanism advocates withdrawal from society, Epicurus placed great value on friendship and community. He believed that the wise person would not only care for themselves, but also value safety, pleasure, and attachment to friends, because these relationships contribute to a more lasting happiness than individual pleasures. In political matters, Epicurus advised students to avoid political debates and power, as they are sources of more anxiety than benefits. He believed that a peaceful life focused on a small, simple community and close relationships would bring more happiness than engaging in the cycle of power and conflict. The spreading influence and intellectual legacy. Epicureanism was later widely propagated through works such as Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, in which he systematized and poetically interpreted Epicurus's ideas in a profound way.
The influence of Epicureanism extended across many centuries, even into the Middle Ages and modern times, where people continued to debate beliefs, happiness, and how to live peacefully in a chaotic world.
Epicurus was not only a philosopher of the pleasure school, he was a pioneer in placing human happiness on the foundation of understanding nature, intuitive knowledge, and personal autonomy. He taught that truth is not far away, but lies in how we perceive the world and let go of false obsessions. This is the most profound legacy of Epicureanism, a philosophy of peace, not through avoidance, but through understanding oneself and the world.
Diogenes, circa 404 to 323 BC, Cynic philosopher. Diogenes of Sinope is one of the most unique figures in ancient philosophical history, not only because of the ideas he propagated, but because his way of life was itself a part of his philosophy. While many other philosophers expressed their ideas through books, he chose to demonstrate his beliefs through vivid, everyday living, that humans often live contrary to their nature, mistaken in self-awareness, and confuse social conventions with the true value of life. Diogenes was born around 404 BC in Sinope, a small city-state on the Black Sea, into a wealthy family. His life changed dramatically when he was exiled from the city after a scandal involving currency debasement, an illegal act later attributed to him in legend as an allegory for how he exchanged false values for true reality. Exiled, Diogenes went to Athens, the center of thought and politics in the Greek world, with nothing in his hands but a small wooden bowl. But then he broke that bowl when he saw a boy drinking water directly with his hand. It was at that moment that he realized he had been carrying unnecessary possessions, the first symbol of renouncing material things to seek a free way of life.
From then on, Diogenes began living as an outsider, without a house, without possessions, only with a large clay jar as his shelter. He wandered the streets of Athens with a lifestyle that made the public both amused and frightened. It is said that he once mocked the crowd by holding a lantern in broad daylight, claiming he was, quote, looking for an honest man, end quote, an act both satirical and a critique of society's hypocrisy and moral superficiality. Other shocking behaviors of his, urinating or defecating in public, mocking social rituals, even using vulgar words and gestures, are not just impulsive acts, but part of the practice of cynicism philosophy. He aims to expose what he considers the hypocrisy of social conventions, or nomos. According to Diogenes and the Cynics, rules like "this should be done privately, not publicly," are meaningless if they are not contrary to nature, or physis. If human nature dictates that we need to eat or go to the bathroom, then why should we be ashamed of it? He believed that all these social norms are just meaningless constraints that humans create themselves, not based on a profound logical or natural standard.
That is one of the fundamental perceptions of cynicism. This philosophy is not afraid of shamelessness, not ashamed, because for them, an action is only shameful when it goes against nature and reason, not when it goes against social conventions. This is a deeply controversial idea. On one hand, it causes cynicism to be seen as rude behavior, and on the other hand, it forces us to think about the rules we follow automatically, without questioning their reasons for existence. Abandoning conventions is just the first step. Diogenes advocates a life of self-sufficiency, autarkia, the ability to provide for oneself with minimal material needs. He had no house, no possessions, not even fame, because in his view, fame is just another form of social shackles. He believed that only by minimizing all material and ego constraints could a person attain true happiness, eudaimonia, a state that is not dependent on anything outside of one's natural and rational self. In his philosophy, assets, power, fame, and social norms are not what make us happy, but often hinder happiness. They lead us into a cycle of desire, ambition, shame, and pride, causing people to forget their original natural essence. Therefore, one of Diogenes' most profound teachings is do not entrust happiness to external things, but focus on what you can control: yourself, your behavior, your thoughts, and your reactions.
Cynicism, a term derived from the Greek kynikos, meaning like a dog, reflects how outsiders perceive cynics because they behave differently, freely, like animals. But Diogenes chose this nickname as a symbol of freedom, like a dog in that it lives according to its natural instincts, regardless of social status, unbound by social rules. What he wanted to point out is that what society considers norms are just illusions, while natural essence is the true reality. The famous story of Alexander the Great's encounter vividly illustrates his spirit. When Alexander, at the height of his power, asked Diogenes what he wanted, Diogenes simply requested the king to stand aside so as not to block the sunlight. This reaction created a powerful symbol. Even in the presence of ultimate authority, what Diogenes valued most was natural light and personal freedom. It was not just a joke. It was a profound declaration of human values beyond all constraints of power and social bonds.
Because of his brave, sometimes excessive, attitude, Diogenes is often seen as eccentric or wild. He lived in difficult circumstances, wandering, begging for survival, without a fixed residence, and repeatedly regarded by society as a freak. But it is precisely these hardships that serve as proof of his philosophy. Living happily does not depend on comfort, status, or social acceptance, but on the ability to self-govern and maintain inner self-control. Therefore, Diogenes was not just a philosopher who spoke words without action. He was a typical example of an extreme philosophical lifestyle, where philosophical action is living according to that philosophy. Instead of constructing complex theories, he exposed what we consider obvious: rules, customs, desires, vanity, and the things that society labels as right simply because we agree to follow them.
Today, although the meaning of the word cynical in modern language has shifted to a negative attitude of pessimism or skepticism, this no longer accurately reflects the spirit of ancient philosophy that Diogenes pursued. According to him, cynicism is not merely mistrust and psychological self-defense, but a path to rediscover the essence of human existence, where independence and happiness are not dependent on false honors and artificial constraints. In summary, Diogenes' story teaches us a profound lesson. Sometimes, to see the truth about life, we don't need to acquire more knowledge, but rather eliminate unnecessary things and dare to challenge what we usually accept as normal. He not only criticized society, he danced with it, using his own freedom and logic to illuminate the illusions that people often defend with rituals and fame. 11. Zeno of Citium, 334 to 262 BC, the first among the Stoic philosophers. Zeno of Citium was one of the greatest thinkers of the Hellenistic period, a person who laid the foundation for a philosophical school that would endure for thousands of years. He was born around 334 BC in Citium, a coastal city in Cyprus that was once a Phoenician colony. Although few details are recorded about his childhood, it is believed that Zeno grew up in a wealthy merchant family, exposed to many different cultures across the Mediterranean, but it was a common tragedy that shaped his entire philosophical life. Legend has it that Zeno once experienced a shipwreck near the coast of Athens, losing all his possessions and being forced to stay in this city, a fateful turning point. In Athens, he happened to read a book about Socrates and was captivated by the image of a wise, self-controlled person who lives steadfastly with reason. This led Zeno to ask a bookseller, "Where can I find such people?" And the answer led him to meet Crates of Thebes, a famous Cynic philosopher who greatly influenced Zeno and caused him to abandon his previous prosperous life to pursue a simple and philosophical way of living.
Around 301 BC, Zeno began teaching in a well-known public place in Athens called the Stoa Poikile, painted porch, a covered walkway with columns where citizens gathered to discuss. From then on, his followers were called Stoics, and his philosophy became the foundation for an extremely influential school of thought. Contrary to many philosopher archetypes of that time, Zeno did not retreat into libraries or palaces, but stood amidst public life to guide others through practical actions, not just abstract debates. This reflects an important point in Stoicism. Philosophy is not an activity detached from the world, but must be integrated with it to help people think and act rightly in all circumstances. The core idea of Zeno and of Stoicism is to live according to logos, meaning according to universal reason and the natural order that unites everything in the universe. This is not the personal reason of each individual, but a fundamental principle that permeates all things, including humans. According to Zeno, when we learn to harmonize with logos, we will live in harmony with ourselves, with society, and with the universe, and that is the path to true happiness, eudaimonia.
One point that makes Stoicism stand out is how it defines value and ethics differently from other systems. Zeno believed that virtue is the only good, and external things like wealth, fame, or suffering cannot make a person inherently better or worse. When people understand that what truly matters is their reaction to events, not the events themselves, they free themselves from unnecessary suffering. From Zeno, Stoicism became a very clear analytical philosophy about what humans can control and what they cannot. As a result, Stoics focus on developing reason, inner discipline, and the right attitude, rather than chasing fleeting things like wealth or fame. If something is beyond our control, worrying about it only causes more anxiety. This is one of the most important principles of Stoic ethics, and also a reason why many modern people find Stoicism highly relevant to today's turbulent life. A profound aspect of Stoicism is the attitude towards emotions. Zeno did not call for people to become insensible or cold, but he wanted individuals to control their emotional reactions reasonably.
An ideal Stoic state is apatheia, a mind not swept away by unstable emotions, not controlled by desire or fear, but responding to the world with calmness, clarity, and proper awareness of values. Zeno built this foundation based on three areas: logic, physics, meaning natural philosophy, and ethics. He believed that to live according to reason and nature, a person must understand the structure of the world and how knowledge functions alongside moral behavior. Although his works no longer exist in complete form, later Stoic tradition, such as Cleanthes, Chrysippus, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, developed and systematized his ideas, making Stoicism one of the most influential schools of philosophy in ancient and subsequent philosophy.
The deeper insight that Stoicism captures, and what makes Zeno a true founder, is the emphasis on inner self-control rather than relying on external circumstances to define happiness or the value of life. Stoicism does not promise to eliminate difficulties, but guides people to face challenges with truthfulness and courage, a profound clarity that many modern philosophers continue to explore. Zeno passed away around 262-263 BC, but his legacy lives on through the evolving perspectives of thinkers like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, individuals who incorporated his philosophy into profound works on human existence, ethics, and self-discipline. Today, Stoicism is not just an ancient philosophical school. It has been revitalized as a practical worldview on how to live consciously, endure, and grow amidst life's upheavals.